Before we start this video, a large thank you to Wendell, Todd, Average Nerd, Mustafa, Michael, Alex, Black Banana, and NYRG for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Hello everybody, today we're going to make it so our character can take damage from outside sources. Let's go to the scripts and then effects folder. Let's right click, make a new script, and let's call this take damage effect. I'm really excited for this one. So this is going to work the same way as our take stamina damage effect, meaning it will be an instant effect. And we're going to add some of the basic functionality of this today, and we'll expand upon it more as more systems are added. So let's go up here and delete the start and update function, put in a namespace as is per tradition. And then let's make this derive from instant character effect. And then we're going to override the process effect because we are inheriting from the base class. And then we can begin writing some logic. But first, let's establish many variables that we'll need in this episode and in many future episodes. So I'm going to try my best to describe these as much as possible, but don't worry about a lot of them right now. Just worry about the damage, and that's really it. So let's make one for header, character causing damage. And this is going to store, if applicable, a character that is basically the cause of the damage being processed on this character. So let's say if I hit your character, then this variable will be my character because I'm the one causing the damage. So I'm going to call that character causing damage. It's pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to make a comment. It's going to say if the damage is caused by another character, then we're basically just going to store that character here. Why are we doing that? Well, let's say your character has a modifier that affects physical damage. Well, we need to know that. So in order to get that modifier, we got to access your character. But like I said, that's not important right now, but it will be important in the future, so we're going to put it there. Next, we're going to make a header for damage, and we're going to include all of our damage types. So we're going to say public float, physical damage. And then we can say a public float for magic or fire, or we'll start with magic damage. And then we'll do fire damage, and we'll also add lightning and holy because those are the elemental damage types in Elden Ring. Now, physical is actually broken down into 4 subtypes. So we're going to make a comment here, and in the future, we're going to break that down even further and give physical its own subtypes, still equating to one major type though. So the subtypes are standard, then strike, then slash, and finally pierce. So that will be affected by your armor's slash and strike and pierce resistances, for example. So a piercing weapon will be more effective on some armors than other. But like I said, right now not important, so we'll make a comment and come back to that. Let's just use the standard function but now as physical. And then we'll add lightning and holy. So you can add whatever damage types you want. I'm just using Elden Rings because this tutorial series is recreating Elden Ring in Unity, the same style game. So let's make a private float for final damage. And this is going to be private because this is basically going to be processed after all of the damage is added together and the calculations for resistances and modifiers have been made. So I'm going to give it its own separate header for final damage. And again, this won't appear in the inspector. So the damage the character basically is dealt or takes after every other calculation has been made. This factors in your base damage defense, your armor absorptions, and the modifiers on the character causing the damage that would, say, buff or debuff the damage. So this is just a number you subtract from your health when it's all said and done. That's it. So let's make a comment here for build-ups. We're not adding those in this video, but in the future, there's a chance that effects will have, say, bleed build-up or poison build-up, and you can, on top of damaging the character, basically register an effect for bleed or poison, etc., etc. So this is a to-do thing in the future. We'll revisit this when we actually add the build-up effects. Not a priority right now because let's get the main and core components out of the way first for sure. But they are very fun, and we are going to revisit this part in the future when we get around to adding them. Next is the animation section. So there's a few options going on here. Basically, we're going to make our first variable public bool will this damage effect play an animation because not all will. Like, for example, if you take tick damage from poison, it's not going to play an animation. But if you take a damage from being struck, it most of the time will. We're going to also make a public bool for manually select damage animation, and by default that's false. If you want to override the damage animation and insert one manually, you would set that to true, and then you would change the public string damage animation to whatever you want to override it to be. So in the future, if you have a certain attack that you want to force a certain damage animation, that's when you would use that. But right now, it's not going to be used, but it will definitely be used in the future. So I'm going to remove the final damage and put it back up here so it sits just under damage, just because I like it sitting in a certain place. And then I'm going to add a header for poise. Well, what is poise? basically, if the poise damage outweighs how much poise you have, you'll play a damage animation and you'll get stunned. I'm generalizing it right now just to keep it simple because we're going to give it its own episode in the future. But if your poise is not broken, then you don't play a damage animation. Or if you do, it's a very light one that you can actually just basically keep running and ignore, or keep attacking and ignore. It doesn't actually stun you. So we'll give that its own video in the future, but we're going to put the variables here for it now. And I'm going to say poise broken, or poise is broken, is set to false by default. If the character's poise does become broken after we check for the calculation, then we will play a stun animation. So again, don't worry about it. It's not important right now. All you need to worry about is the damage numbers. Each of these things will probably get their own episode. So now down here, sound effects. This one's very simple. Basically, will this damage effect play a sound effect? By default, I'm going to set that to true. And also on top of the regular sound effect, you can also have an elemental sound effect. So in a lot of games like Elden Ring, if you have a slashing weapon that also is buffed with, say, holy damage, then you'll get the holy sound effect on top of the regular slashing sound effect. So let's put that there as well. And this one is also optional. I'll say used on top of a regular sound effect. So for example, again, if you set your sword on fire and you slash somebody, then you'll also get the fire damage sound effect on top of the regular damage sound effect. So I'm just going to make a comment here and say magic /fire /lightning /holy. And again, you can use this for any additional sound effect other than the main damage sound effect. Just basically play two at once. So I'm going to make a header right below that and say direction damage was taken from or damage came from. Why are we doing this? Well, let's say I'm standing behind you and you're facing forward and I strike you. Then you're going to want to play a damage animation as if you were hit from behind and knocked forward. Or if I'm to the right of you and I hit you, then obviously the force is going to push you to the left. So to basically decide what damage animation we need to play, we need the angle that we're hit from. Then we need the contact point, which is a vector 3, because we need to basically choose where we're going to instantiate the blood effects on the character. You want them to be at the point that the character was struck. So I'm going to make a comment under or next to angle hit from, used to determine what damage animation to play. So for example, move backwards or to the left or to the right, you get it. So basically what I just said. I encourage you to make that comment more clear if you want, just so you remember what the purpose of this is for. And the contact point is basically just the point on the collider the damage is happening, so we have a good idea of where to instantiate the blood splatter effect. So I'm just going to say use to determine where the blood effects instantiates. So we need to know if our character is alive or dead, and that should be a network variable because that should be a thing that everybody knows. So let's go to the character manager, and you can put this in the character network manager. For some reason, I like putting this on the character manager under a header called status, just so when I check a character, usually the first thing I check is the character manager. And this is the only network variable I tend to put on my character manager. So if you want to put it on your character network manager, that's totally fine. For whatever reason, I like having it here. It makes the most sense to me. I'm just going to make a public network variable bool for isDead. I'm going to initialize it as a false by default variable that anybody can read, but only the owner can write. So pretty standard stuff, just like we've done with every other network variable before. So let's basically check if we're dead, because we don't even want to process this effect if we're dead. We just want to basically do nothing. So if the character.isDead.value return, we don't want to process an additional damage step because that can cause all kinds of weird stuff to happen. So we're just going to make a note here and say if the character is dead, do not process any additional damage effects. So it'll come in here, it'll see that, and it will basically just stop right then and there, and nothing beyond this will be ran. Next, we would have to make an additional check, which we don't have added yet. Is our character invulnerable? Meaning, do they have invincibility active? This will be during a thing like a dodge or a roll. And if so, we do the same thing, we return. We don't have invulnerability right now, so we're going to revisit that when we add it. And then we're going to say calculate the damage. And then we are going to say we want to, right below that, check which direction the damage came from. And this will be determined by variables it's fed, and then it will determine the animation we play. And then we want to play a damage animation, if applicable. And then we want to play check for build-ups when that is applicable. So think of poison and bleed, anything like that. In Dark Souls 3, for example, you got curse. And then we want to play some damage sound effects and video effects. So that we stuff like blood, and then, the damage noise. You can think of that default damage noise that Elden Ring and Dark Souls all have. And then right below here, we want to say if character is AI, then we want to basically assign that AI character the target that just attacked them, if applicable. And we can further expand upon this, so we make this only happen sometimes or all the time, or it's dependent on if another target is closer. But this is just a general statement for now, so we're going to come back and revisit that too when we have AI. So you can see there's a lot of stuff here we're going to add on to in the future. So let's make our first function here outside of the process effect, private void calculate damage, make it require a character manager, and call that character. So this is the only one we're going to worry about right now in this video, because this is just the bare bones of getting this effect through, and we add on to it as we create more systems. We start by saying, if character causing damage does not equal null, then we want to check for damage modifiers on that character. But again, that's not applicable right now, so it's just a comment. We'll come back to that in the future. So if we do have a character that is in fact causing us damage, we got to check for his modifiers, because it's going to change this damage. It could be a physical modifier, maybe he's having a physical attack and he has a buff to that. Maybe he has a trinket on that makes his fire damage 15% harder. We have to apply that to the base damage he's applying, etc., etc. So you can make a comment here if you want to. For example, physical damage times equals character causing damage dot physical damage modifier, yada, yada, yada. I'm not going to keep that comment here because, again, this will get us whole entire video. So we can erase this right now and revisit it in the future. So what else are we looking at in the calculate damage function? Well, let's make some more comments for future inputs here. We're going to say check character for flat damage reduction. So basically, when you level up stats in Dark Souls and Elden Ring, you actually get flat damage reduction from some damage types like holy and fire and magic. And each stat will oftentimes give you different flat damage reductions. So this is just basically a flat number that is subtracted from your total damage. Then we're going to check for character armor absorptions. So as you know, a lot of equipment in the game has a percentage of damage it will absorb. And then we subtract the percentage of the total damage that it absorbs from the damage that's remaining. So for example, if you absorb 23% of damage, then right now 23% of the total damage is taken away from what we have so far. And finally, we add all of the damage types together, and then we process that damage type and apply the final damage and subtract it from the character's health. So this is the part we can do. This is the part that we can just do right now. So to do that, what we want to do is first change this to an int, the final damage dealt. That's my bad, because again, our health is an int, so we should always be using that as an integer value. Then we're going to say final damage dealt is equal to mathf round to int, and we add every single damage type together. So physical damage plus magic damage plus fire damage plus holy damage plus lightning damage. And remember, not every attack is going to have all these damage types. They'll most of the time just be 0. Most attacks only have 1, maybe 2. So, but if you have more than one, you have to add them all together and process it as a final damage type. Lastly, we say if final damage is less or equal to 0, then final damage should be 1. It should always be at least 1. I believe Elden Ring and Dark Souls also do this. You should always hit at least 1 all the time. Then we're going to say character network manager current health value. You could say equals, and then you could say the same thing again. Then you could say minus the final damage dealt. That's the long way of typing it. Or you could just say minus equals final damage dealt. That's the shorthand way of typing it. I'm saying this a bunch of times throughout the series just because I know I've said it before, but I'll probably continue to say it at least a dozen more times. So let's make a comment down here. Then we're going to calculate poise damage, which we don't have yet, to determine if the character plays a damage animation. If their poise is not broken, they will poise through the attack and not play a damage animation. And if their poise is broken, they will in fact play a damage animation. So that's not there yet, so we're basically good. Let's drop in and calculate damage right here. And we can pretty much almost test this out. We just need to make something deal this effect. Now, before we do that, though, under calculate damage, we're going to say if character dot is not owner, then return. You don't want the person who is not the owner of their character running this logic for calculating damage, because we're modifying our health here, and that should be left to the owner. And also choosing an animation should be left to the owner. So over here, let's copy the character effects, instant effects take stamina damage, and let's paste it on top here and just change it to take damage. And then we can actually create this take damage scriptable object in our project. And then we can actually get to testing it real soon. So go to data, effects, instant effects, keep this stuff organized if you can, and then go to character effects, instant effects, and create a take damage effect. So let's go to the world character effect manager next. And what we want to do is actually give this its own variable, because it's going to be referenced nearly all of the time. So we're going to want to add it to our instant effects list just to give it its own ID and yada, yada, yada. But it's also going to have its own variable here. So we'll make a header for damage, because in the future we'll also have a take blocked damage effect. And potentially a take critical damage effect because it's cooler to give that its own effect for other reasons I will discuss later. That's for stuff like backstabs and riposts. But I digress. So make a variable public take damage effect, and then drag in our take damage effect that we just made. So every time someone takes a damage in your game, it will be basically a copy that's made of this effect, and then give it its own values. So add it to the instant effects list and add it to that variable. Okay, so after that's done, let's actually go to our world scene. And why are we doing that? Well, we gotta make something in the scene hurt us so we can test this out. And obviously this is going to be a test object that is deleted almost immediately after, but we gotta make sure it works. So let's do it in a fun way. Let's create a cube or any kind of 3D object that has a collider. And then I'm going to just reset the position and drag it here closer to the center of the screen. I'm going to call it the wall of pain. And I'm going to just position it over here and just basically make it just look like a small wall. And I'm going to tick is trigger on the box collider. That's important. It needs to be a trigger. And I'm going to show you why just in a bit. So I'm just going to move this around until I am satisfied with the position of it. And I'm going to make it a little bit thinner. So it's just almost like just a tiny little thin wall that we're going to walk through. And I'm going to make the X position 0 because I feel the need to. And that is basically it. Let's add a script to it. We're going to call it Damage Collider. And this will be the base class for all types of damage done in the game. Think of like a melee damage collider, a spell damage collider, a bomb damage collider. They will all derive from this. So what are we going to do in here? Well, we can copy basically all of our damage types. I'm going to make a header here for damage types. And think of the take damage effect as a thing that's always created by a damage collider. So for that reason, they share a lot of common data. Like when you're punching somebody, your fist will have a damage collider, and on that damage collider, the fist will have data telling the game its physical damage, magic, fire, lightning, and holy. Your sword will have a damage collider with these same values. So every damage collider will have these values. Now we use a thing called onTriggerEnter, and as you can see here, it's called when the collider enters the trigger. And as you can see, this is set to is a trigger. What does this mean? Well, we can walk through it. We don't collide with it. But since it's a trigger, it can trigger this function when we enter it. Now, we only want to run this on our characters as not to, waste memory and stuff with the game. So we could say if other.gameObject.layer is equal to layer mask character. I think it's actually layer mask.name to layer. Yeah. And then you could say character, or there's a better option here. What we could do is actually only run this on other colliders with a layer of character, or in the future we'll call it damageable character because we're going to make each limb have its own damage collider. So what you want to do here is, whoops, I forgot to save that, there we go, is go over now to the layers, and we want to add another layer for a damage collider. So I'm just going to put it a little bit past this, let's say honestly 8, 9, or 10, just to give some space away from here. Yeah, we'll say 10. So damage collider. And we're going to make it so the damage collider is only able to collide with character layers. How do we do this? Go to Edit, and then go down to Project Settings, and then go over here to Physics, and you see this little weird-looking checkbox thing down here? Go to Damage Collider, untick Default, untick Transparent Effects, untick everything except for Character. This makes it so that anything with this layer is only able to collide with the layer that you have checked off. So damage colliders can now only collide with character objects. Go back into your world scene, go to your wall of pain, whatever you've made, and set the layer to damage collider. Now, every time you make a damage collider, you have to set the layer with that script on it and the collider to damage collider. I'm going to set the physical damage to 25, just because, just a random number to make sure this works. And then I'm going to say inside onTriggerEnter, we want to say character manager, but I got to add my namespace because I forgot, and I can't access my character manager without my namespace because it's inside there. So we're going to say character manager, and you could just say character here, but I'm going to say damage target because we're at the end of a damage collider here, so that makes the most sense to me. Equals other.getComponent character manager. Now we want to check to see if this is null. So if damage target does not equal null, then we run some logic. What do? Well, we're going to need a few things here that are just basically comments again because we can't do them yet until we add more to the game, but we will be able to process our damage, which is the most important thing. So let's make a header for our contact point. I'm going to make a private vector3 for our contact point. And in the next episode, we're going to use this to instantiate blood when we expand upon this further. I'm going to say contact point is equal to, and we're going to use other, as in the other collider, .gameObject.getComponent, and we're going to access the collider that's on this character. So we would say collider. And then we would say dot closest point on bounds, and then we want to pass inside of that the transform.position. So that'll get the point on the collider that is close that it hits, and that will return that as a contact point, which we can then pass the damage effect. So next we're going to make a comment. Check if we can damage this target. What do I mean by that? Well, based on the character's friendly fire. So if you have two characters that are on quote unquote the same team, and you don't want to allow them to damage each other, then that's how we're going to check right there. So for example, co-op gameplay, you can't damage your co-op friend. Unless you want that to happen, we're going to make a check right there. Next, we check if the target is blocking, and instead of damaging the target, then we would try to process a block damage effect, but that's not there yet, so let's just keep it as a comment. And lastly, we check for invulnerability, and if that's the case, we don't want to get this far at all, and we return. And if you pass all those checks, we finally damage our target. So let's make the protected virtual void for damage. We're just going to say damage target. Why is it virtual? Because when we make other damage colliders, like the melee damage collider or the spell damage collider, we're going to override this to give it its own functionality because it's going to be modified just a little bit. So let's make it require a character manager, obviously the damage target, and then we're just going to say damage target and pass our damage target. Now, what are we doing inside here? It's pretty straightforward. We're just going to instantiate a take damage effect and give it its values and process it from the character. And then from there, the take damage effect handles all the heavy lifting. So we don't want to damage the same target more than once, though, in a single attack. Okay, so because of that, we want to keep a list of things that we're hitting. Like, let's say you have multiple character colliders on one character, which we're going to have in the future, multiple limbs. If a sword crosses multiple limbs, it'll try to damage the same target more than once. We don't want that. We only want each target getting one damage calculation per attack. So because of that, let's go up here and make a header. I'm also going to make contact point protected vector 3 so other classes can access it. Let's make a header for characters damaged. Let's make a protected list of character managers, and we're going to initialize it as a new list. And basically, every time we turn on and off the damage collider in the future, this is going to reset the characters damaged. So basically, what we want to do is say if, and then reference our list here, if characters damaged dot contains, and that just checks the list for this, we pass the damage target we want to return. We don't want to damage this character again because we've clearly already damaged them. Otherwise, add them to the list. Then, right down here, we make a variable for take damage effect. We call it damage effect, and then we say equals, and we instantiate an effect. Remember, make a new one. Don't just use the one that's already there. And then we access our world character effects manager.instance.take damage effect. Next, we say damage effect dot physical damage equals physical damage, damage effect dot magic damage equals magic damage, etc. Fire damage equals fire damage, lightning and holy, you get it. Poise, contact point, pass it all. If you want, we can even make a function that requires all of these variables on the take damage effect, and we can just call it initialize damage effect, which we probably will do in the future, but for now, I'll just leave these variables as they are until the effect is more fleshed out when we add more stuff to it. So after that, let's go down here and say damage target dot, and we just want to say character effects manager, which we don't have a variable for, so let's go make that. We do that by going to the character manager and making a character effects manager variable, getting it on awake, and then making it public. So let's use hide and inspector again too, because we don't need to see this. We're just making it public so it can be accessed from another script, which is what we're doing right now. So hide and inspector, public character effects manager on awake. We're going to say character effects manager is equal to get component because it sits on the same game object as the script. And then we're going to say character effects manager. Now, back on the damage collider, we say damage target dot character effects manager dot process instant effect, and we pass our newly created damage effect. And since we just created it and set up all the values, we're going to process that, and then it's going to run the logic we just made under damage effect, which is then going to basically give our characters some damage. So again, we're using on trigger enter, because remember, we go over here and you can see that this collider on this wall of pain is definitely a trigger. So let's make a new prototype material. And I'm just going to make this red because red seems to basically signify that this is probably dangerous. I'm going to make it just a brighter or a darker, maybe a little bit darker. It's probably harsh in the eyes. Let's see. Yeah, that's really bright. Okay, so I'm going to make that a little bit more dark. And we should be good to go. So let's save the scene. And next, we can go back to our main menu scene. I'm going to make a new game. That's important. And then let's just walk into this wall and see what happens. So I got my player here, and you can see here I'm not dead. That's cool. I have a max health of what appears to be 15 because my vitality is 1. So this wall is actually going to do too much damage. Let's just actually lower the wall's damage to say 7, which should be about half of our health to make sure this is working properly. So wall of pain, physical damage 7. It's going to reset back to 25 when I reset the scene, but that's okay. So now let's walk through it and see what happens. Okay, so it did damage us, but it looks like it took too much, or there's a problem with our UI. So I'm just going to figure this out by simply going to the source and determining what it is. Let's go to our take damage function, and this is our calculate damage, sorry, on the take damage effect. I'm going to put a debug log after all the damage has been calculated. I'm going to say final damage given equals plus the final damage. Now let's walk through the wall again. You can see that, yeah, okay, I'm taking 25 damage. So we know it's not the damage. So that means it has to be our UI most likely. So let's go over to the player UI manager and let's go to our health bar. And yep, you can see the max value for this is definitely probably going to be 1 as opposed to the stamina bar is 100. So if I crank this value, yes. So we know for some reason we're not actually setting our health bar's maximum value. And this is why. You see how this is called on value changed under vitality? Well, the problem is our vitality is actually never changing past this 1 from the prefab. So we can fix that. This will never be the case when we actually make the game because when you select a class, it's going to change your stats to the character's class that you've selected. So let's set vitality and endurance to 1 on the prefab. And then to simulate selecting a class for now, this is temporary code. Under the World Save Game Manager, under New Game, let's manually change the vitality and endurance to 10 and 10. So we'll say player.playerNetworkManager.vitality.value is equal to 10 and do the same thing for the endurance. Maybe we'll change the vitality to 15 just so it's different. But anyway, whenever you create a class in your game, these stats are going to change. So you're going to trigger the on value changed every single time. So this is a temporary piece of code until we actually create the classes to do that. And if this works now, we'll know that the problem was because the value was never changing and it was never updating the HP bar. So new game again. Let's go into the game. It should set our vitality to 15 and our endurance to 10 and our HP bar should update accordingly. So I'm in the game here now. Let's actually walk through this wall. It should do 25 damage and yes it does. And our health bar does update accordingly. So you can see now our health bar actually has the max stat it's supposed to. So it was because the value was never changing, and because the value was never changing, we were never actually setting the HP bar's max. All right guys, I really have fun doing these effects videos, and I really have fun doing this series in general. It is the most fun I've ever had on YouTube, so I thank you very much for tuning in with me every single week. I really am having a blast. And if you have made it this far, as usual, I'm going to say my broken record line. I would greatly appreciate a like and a comment. I know it gets so annoying to hear every single YouTuber say that, but it really does help with the series. And I just want to say thank you very much for being here. And obviously, a special thank you to my patrons. It is genuinely because of you all I get to keep doing this, and as I just said, I do really have a lot of fun doing it. So guys, we're going to continue to expand upon this system. We're going to add things like fall damage and stuff too, and we're going to make a death event to basically just add a nice little game loop into here. So I'm excited for that. I will see you guys next week on the next episode, and as always, I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.